Now that we have looked at how to work with value, proper shading techniques, we're going to do a texture practice. So this is the last application, the last practice we're going to do before we start our project. When it comes to texture and creating the look and feel of real life textures on a two-dimensional surface, you're looking at two major elements, line and value. You're also looking at the principle of art of contrast. To create the illusion of textures on the surface of a paper, we use those two elements and one principle to copy what we're seeing. So here is 4 different textures we're going to go over. One is a brick texture, one is a feather texture, one is kind of like metal diamond plate type of material, and the other one's a cloth burlap like material. When you first start working with your drawing, with your image, we're going to first do a light outline. So that's what we're going to do in each of these texture boxes. So I'm going to start at the top here. I'm going to work with the brick texture. And I'm going to use a 6H pencil. I'm not going to apply heavy pressure. I want my lines to be very light, because notice when we look at these, other than the diamond plate where the grooves are set into the metal, nothing is a dark line. And even these are not so much a line as they are small shapes that are filled in with different values. So to begin, I'm going to come up here and as best as I can just kind of redraw what it is I'm seeing. So I see up near the top here is a line that comes across. And below that is the beginning of some bricks. And there's some white spaces between these bricks. So I'm going to sketch that out. So again, I want to do this very lightly, because my goal is, after I kind of draw this out, is I'm going to use my values and everything I learned about shading to create a more realistic looking texture. So I'm looking at each individual brick, and again, as best as I can, getting them drawn on here. So what that means is maybe they're not all exactly 100% perfectly the same size as what is over here, but they're close. I have a very long one here in about the position where this very long one is here. I have 3 shorter bricks after it. I have 3 shorter bricks after it. I had a piece of a brick in front of it. There's the piece of the brick in front of it. So then when I come down to my next row, this beginning brick comes over and underneath these 2. And then there's a smaller piece beside it. And a smaller piece. So this one I got a little bit too long, and this is why I like to work with the 6H, so that I can come in, make corrections, and try to get things a little bit more accurate. Now if I am going to have to erase anything, I want to do that lightly. And working with some light lines makes it easier to erase without much pressure on my eraser. So I did make my one row a little bit too wide. So I'm going to end up with this row here as my last one. But for the most part, I'm fairly close to my original reference. So now that I have my shapes drawn, I'm ready to start shading. So anything that is a lighter gray, I can start with my 6H. And as we discussed before, I do not want to press into my darkest value with the 6H. I want to be able to layer on top of it. So at the most, I'd probably maybe get close to my medium range gray of values with my 6H. But I'm going to start shading in some light areas. And for me, that's mostly what's in between the bricks, that mortar. I'm using my circular shading technique. So that's starting with my lightest gray. Now at the moment it looks dark because all it is up against white. So this is where we start looking at not only applying value, so we have our lines down, we drew it. We're starting to apply value, and now we're going to start looking at contrast. So contrast is what shows the difference. So right now, with just the 6H on there, those lines look fairly dark. But I'm going to be applying values onto the brick that are even darker. So that's going to create contrast, which will then help these also lighten up. Again, when I first start a pencil drawing and I start working through these pencils, anything you apply is going to look dark because you're going from white paper, adding grays to it. The goal is that when we're done, that these look light enough because the values on the bricks themselves that are darker have done the job of creating that contrast, which will then make these look a lot lighter because darker values are near them. So I'm going in with an HB, and I'm going to start applying some darker values. So above here, it's a very thin, dark space I see. Some other grays around it. And again, I'm working with my circular shading technique. So I'm just trying to observe some values I have here and start applying some darker and mid-tone values. So there's the beginning of my first row. So this does take some time. Your goal is to, 1, carefully draw with a light pencil the outline of the textures you are seeing. 2, once that outline is drawn, then start applying value. Start with some lighter values, working your way into darker values. And 3, pay attention to contrast. Where are there dark values against light values? Where are there light values against dark values? Is there a large contrast, meaning a great difference between the values near each other? Or is there a low contrast, meaning there's not much difference between the values next to each other? You're going to do this for each of these practices. I don't care which one you start with, and whether you start with the brick one like I demonstrated here, or you start with the feathers, or the diamond plate, or the burlap. But you want to first draw out the texture like I did, start applying some light values like I did, and then go in with your other pencils to create some darker values and start creating more texture. Line, value, contrast. That's what we're working on. So we've taken a look at the bricks at the top here, and I still have a lot more shading to do. But let me give you some pointers for your other textures here. So when it comes to the feathers, again, you don't want to color or shade anything in yet with any of the graphite. You want to first create a line drawing. So I'd maybe look for some things that stand out, and usually I look for those things near the edges of my paper. So where this is a more complicated texture because it has many layers to it compared to our bricks. So one thing I notice is down here in this corner, there's 2 diagonal areas. That could be a change in the body. That could be just a change in the feather pattern. I'm not sure what that is, but it stands out to me. So that is probably where I would first put some sketch lines using that 6H for value changes. So I know there's something happening down here that I need to pay attention to. The next thing is I have this corner over here cut off. So again, I'm just going to try to, as best as I can, decide how far over along this line, how far up this shape is. And again, we're going to try to get as accurate as we can, but we know we're going to make some mistakes because we're not using any drawing methods like grid drawing. After that, I'm going to look for some other areas. So over here also is a very distinctive separation of values. So this is one area where we don't have a gradation. So that really stands out to me. And then I start to see some of the feather patterns here. So I'm trying to judge how wide this space is and start getting an idea of where these other layers of feathers. So when it comes to a pattern like this where it's a little bit more complicated, I like to break it down into pieces. Usually I look at pieces closest to my outer edges, or I look for pieces that are very large and noticeable. And once I kind of have those started and sketching out, then it's kind of just puzzling together other parts to this. So I have this little feather here started. It gets overlapped by another feather that comes up here. That then leads to this very pointy one that comes close to my line here. So you may end up missing some feathers, just like I ended up missing a few bricks down the bottom. But we want to try to get as much detail drawn into this as possible for us to practice our texture. Another distinctive area I see is where these feathers all tend to kind of roll into each other. It kind of creates a line here. And I notice that line comes over here, and then that's when I start getting into these really close feathers. And I notice a very distinctive set of curves here. So again, this is a very difficult texture, and we're going to do our best. So right now, since these are really close and small, I'm just giving myself an idea of which direction they curve in. So that's the beginnings of a sketch there. So when I start adding shading, I'm going to again start looking for areas that are very distinctive. So I have a darker corner here and a darker area behind it. So again, unless I'm noticing a texture, I want to work with circular shading here. So from here is where I start getting to some really small detail with the feathers. So if I do start over here, I'm going to look for some dark shapes, and as best as I can, shade those in. And in fact, I'm going to turn this so I can observe my shading as I apply it. So I'm starting with some of the dark areas in between the lighter lines. Now this isn't done, nowhere near done. And there's a lot of lighter gray values I have to go in and put and place, and some medium tones that I also had to place, but I'm looking right now at these darker tones and I'm trying to use those to help me get my texture going. So as I come further out from this more compact area, I'm going to find that I have larger areas to start into, and that's where these larger shapes I drew are going to help. So again, this is an exercise. It's okay if you make mistakes on this. It's to start to help you start thinking about how value and lines and contrast and even shapes really start to work to create different textures that we're observing in real life objects. So as I work my way out here, when I get into this area out here and working with the larger shapes, I'm going to have a little bit more for any place where I see a gradient. So like this larger feather I see out here has a little bit more of a gradient, so I'd start a little bit darker where the other feathers overlap it. And as I start working my way out, again, I'm using the circular shading technique. I want it to be as smooth because I want my value changes to identify the form, not heavy dark lines as if it was a coloring book page. And I want to, especially something like this where it's such a small, fine, detailed texture, I want my edges to be as clean as possible. So as I work my way out, I'm going to lift up on my pencil, get a little bit of lighter grays worked in there, and then what helps this edge show up here is the fact that it has itself a darker gray in behind it with these other feathers. Now compared to the edge of them, it's a darker gray. It's a little bit lighter in value considering the values I can get with, I'm currently working with my HB pencil, but it is still darker than the value in front of it, which is that tip of that other feather. So that is how you start separating your feather pieces. So if I came in here with this one in front of the one I just shaded, again, same observation here. It's darker down here where it is overlapped by other feathers. And it's that gray edge there that really defines it. Now there's a little bit of texture there. I see a little bit of the feather, those fine little parts of it, creating a little bit of a texture on an edge. So that's something I usually put in last. So once I start establishing my values to get my main objects filled in, that's when I'll come in then and maybe do a little bit of directional shading where I just bring some light directional movements in to create a little bit of that texture. I'll bring it in also from the opposite end to kind of just break up that soft edge I have. But again, it's something I go in and add last, because if I just came in here and started to just make little lines, it actually takes longer to get something that looks decent and like the texture we're trying to work with than if you fill things in first with the circular shading and then come in and add a few directional shading lines to add a certain texture to your object. So that is an example of some ways in which you can start thinking about these shapes for a more complicated texture such as the feathers. Try to give yourself as many guidelines as possible. Draw as many shapes and lines that you can see, and then start adding some value to it, and it'll start giving you more of that feather-like texture. So like I said, this over here still needs to develop. I've only done one value of pencil. I still need to go in and narrow down some spaces. I need to add some lighter grays because these are not as bright white as the paper, but it's a start. When it comes to a texture like this, I would probably start by creating a slanted grid. So I see here, these two pieces are in this corner, and then we have however many grids are coming across. Gives me an idea of their spacing. There's another set that starts down here. And by blocking things off like this, then it gives me a little bit more of an idea of where I need to sketch what. Once I have that, then I can come in the opposite direction. So up here, I'm getting partials, trying to see what ones are the most noticeable. And I'm looking at like the spaces between this texture, like where exactly is this going? And that kind of helps me then judge the breaking up of the space here. So once I kind of give myself some guidelines there, then let's see, each one is 5 lines. So if I start down here, I have to get 5 lines in here, and I'm just going to lightly sketch those out, and then it turns this way, and I have 5 lines going this way. Once I kind of get this started and just give myself some guidelines as to where these etchings are located, then I can start thinking about thickening up and adding value to them. So a lot of the value is going to be in the background. I'll probably go in very light first so that I have all these light areas established, and then start darkening up around them. So that would be my hint for this type of texture, is first give yourself some markings and ideas of where exactly these etchings are located, and kind of get those sketched out. And then from there, go around with your background shading and continue to just add some value to them, making sure that these lines are not going to be left as just single lines. They have some movement to them. They kind of pinch off at the ends, and they have a more bulkier middle to the line. So they are not just single pencil lines that you need to create. They have some form and thickness to them. The last one is the burlap. And what I would suggest with the burlap is similar to what we did up here with the bricks. It's a lot smaller pieces though. I would maybe start giving yourself a very, very, very light idea of how the spacing occurs on the burlap. They're very, very narrow rows of sections of fibers. And then I would also start looking at the bigger white spaces. I've also in the past just started to make little shape. I've started like in a corner. There is a dark space here. And I do a little bit of negative shading, meaning I'm going to shade in the negative spaces around the fibers of the burlap. And I'm creating these little rectangle like shapes that are in between the individual pieces of burlap. And so this one does take a little bit of time. They are varying in shapes. The most important part here is trying not to make those shapes too large. I don't want to make big, large rectangles. They're really, really small shapes here. And to watch your line spacing too, because what we tend to do when we draw, and what I've noticed is, and I remember doing this myself when I was younger, I see this texture, so I start, oh, okay, it's burlap, there's some weaving fibers going this way and this way, which maybe as just a illustration using line and not worrying about value, that might be okay. But in this case, the fibers are lighter than the negative space areas that they create, the little pockets left between the weaving of the fibers. So I actually need to shade in the negative space fibers, those little holes between the fibers, and leave the white spaces, and eventually possibly adding some light gray to those to really get the look of the burlap. So those are just some hints for you for these different textures. You will start work on these after your final value scale practice. So you did 3 types of value scale. The very first one we did was sudden and 4 directions. These ones, I'll call them A. These top rows, A was sudden and using the smooth shading technique. And then our B areas, the ones you're just finishing up, B is our gradual blended. And again, you're using smooth shading technique. So once you've worked through these, then you want to get a texture handout and start applying some texture to this handout, trying to copy the textures that are to the right over to the left. Remember, you want to use line, you want to use value, and you want to use contrast. And it does help to recognize the shapes that are creating the pockets of different values in each texture.